Hello and welcome to another Intersections podcast. My name is Alex Cunningham and I have the privilege of introducing Kuan Collins as she interviews Mark McGrath and Brian Rivera. Take it away, Kuan.
All right. Thanks, Alex, for the introduction. Today, I am so excited to have in the studio Brian Ponch Rivera and Mark McGrath, both of AGLX. I had the pleasure of interacting with Mark, I think on LinkedIn. This has been like the best outcome of a LinkedIn engagement I've ever had, and more to follow on our work that we're going to hopefully do together. So AGLX is an adaptive strategy consultancy that empowers organizations to be confident in complexity and turn uncertainty into a competitive advantage. So we're going to talk a lot about that. Work with organizations and the leaders within those organizations looking to change their mindset, fresh thinking, want to challenge the status quo, and believe that strategies should not live on the shelf and should be living engagement, adaptive approach that makes a real ongoing difference in the organization, even as the world continues to change, which is, constant. Let's see. So Mark is a United States Marine. Thank you for your service. Served as an officer for 6 years. Ponch is a naval aviator. Also, thank you for your service, who had a career in a carrier-based fighter aviation platform. Mark and Ponch, which is how we have connected, are the hosts of the podcast No Way Out, which is dedicated to advancing and developing the theories of John R. Boyd, who's my new hero, to help individuals and teams in all disciplines to improve the capacity for free and independent action. So yeah, your passion for OODA Loops and John Boyd definitely came through in the post. And I think I reacted to one of those posts and here we are today. So I'm really glad to have you guys in the studio. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So let's get started with how you guys, give me some background beyond what we just talked about with, your careers and how you guys connected and how this No Way Out thing started.
I'll just say LinkedIn was instrumental in how we connected, and I'll turn it over to Mark on going back through, I think, 3-4 years now, where we started interacting on LinkedIn. And Mark, I think some of that started about 2019. Is that correct? When you were commenting on some of the stuff I was doing with Dave Snowden, is that right?
It was well in advance of pre-COVID, and I actually attended a webinar that you did for a group in Africa, and discussing OODA and Boyd, and you and I got in some back and forth, and then we eventually realized that we came at very different angles from similar backgrounds, but different at the same time, to the same conclusions that most people do not understand Boyd and OODA, and we were both dedicated to pursuing the effective development and teaching of it. And once I realized that we connected, eventually we wound up being business partners.
That's so cool.
So.
Yeah, it's all LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn has been instrumental in so many things over the last 10, 15 years for me. And I'm seeing the use of it as far as connecting. Hate to say the village idiots, but every village has an idiot, and Mark and I were able to connect through that capability. So good to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, when you guys started talking about OODA, so I've studied OODA Loop since I started my career, and this was back in, I don't even want to say, it was a long time ago. So because I'm only 21, it's all good. And but I remember it was always sort of a footnote. It was sort of like, here's the process and you should know it, and it's one of the tools in your toolbox as a program manager, as a systems engineer. And I remember we didn't even bring up Boyd and his, the how OODA loops were, how it came to be. But, with other things like Deming and all the other, scholars, we would talk about those guys at length. So it's always kind of weird because I recognized, the significance of OODA. And especially as they become like an agile practitioner, DevSecOps, and now, we're talking more about accelerating. How do we get the government to think faster, right? And get integration of all the disruptive technologies faster, and figure out how do we accelerate the pace at which we're making these decisions. And OODA is, oh my God, is like fundamental to thinking that way, right? And even before we started recording here, just talking about mindset and how the brain functions, as I've been learning more and more about the parasympathetic nervous system and the system 1, system 2 thinking, it's so basic, right? And it's so fundamental. So I love that you guys are trying to spread this gospel further. So talk to me more about OODA and sort of where John came up with this. And I love the history that you guys have uncovered with John Boyd and how he wasn't really an academic, right? So tell me more about that.
John Boyd is so much more than OODA and OODA Loop. And unfortunately, the way most have gone around teaching him, and even how I learned about him originally in Naval ROTC and eventually as an officer in the Marines, and was autodidactic to go back and really understand that this is so much more than a little process that people, quote unquote, use in certain situations. It's actually an axiomatic explanation of how humans shape what they see, how they make decisions, how they act, and how they learn, and how they ultimately adapt. And it melded well when I didn't have this epiphany until after I left the Marine Corps and was working in the capital markets, specifically in the great financial crisis, and really starting to see the patterns of capital markets were not unlike the patterns of conflict that had been, to your point, a footnote, or maybe we got a summary. And I started really digging more and more on Boyd and combining it with my knowledge of economics, which is my master's degree, and seeing these connections. Mm-hmm. And then realizing that what he's actually trying to tell everyone is that by learning how to unlock the cognitive power that you're born with, you can develop it. And eventually, when you understand how it all works, your results can only be positive, geometric, or therefore you're adapting. So that was kind of my draw. And then when I connected with Ponch, he saw it that way too. Although we come from different backgrounds and specialties, and we have varying interests inside of the the sort of the multidisciplinary aspect of Boyd, and Boyd is extraordinarily multidisciplinary, to the point where the first time Ponch and I ever met physically was actually in the Boyd archives.
That's
and
so cool.
And going through it at Marine Corps University. Yeah. So what would you add to that, Ponch?
Oh, man, we could talk for hours on this. Many people get the OODA Loop wrong, and many people associate it directly with lessons from the 1950s in fighter aviation, and that's not true. It's you're able to reflect back on something you experienced. So if Boyd was a musician, let's say in the 1950s and 1960s, and he studied what he studied in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, he would have come to the same conclusion, I believe. Mm-hmm. So it's often misassociated, I don't know if that's the correct term, with fighter aviation. A fighter pilot did uncover the power of what we call the OODA Loop now, and then made some connections back to the the ability to see from an F-86 and fighting MiGs and understanding things like that. That is very true. He reflected back on that. We also had an experience, or John Boyd did, where he had to learn physics, right? And understand entropy. And entropy is becoming, I wouldn't say mainstream, but in about 4 or 5 years, we'll see more people talk about entropy. Yeah. We'll see more people talk about physics here as we learn more about AI. We learn more about the universe, and even on the podcast, we've had some advanced thinkers on there. But John Boyd had to learn it on his own, and you can see it there on the left: entropy, Heisenberg, the what do you call it? The not trilogy. Help me out, Mark.
Yeah, sort of his 3 major inputs of scientific law that he felt was what got him started on the path with his only published work, Destruction and Creation, of how he evolved and developed it over the course of 20 years. This goes up to 1996, which gives us OODA Loop, as loop in quotes, which is what he always used, and which was a year before he died. But the point is that Ponch and I spend a lot of time trying to make, is that when you reduce the scope and scale of John Boyd's work to just fighter aviation, just learning a process inside of fighter aviation, you've absolutely missed the boat. Yeah. You're not even remotely in the same ballpark. And these are only some. I mean, you can only fit so many things.
Right. There's only space for bubbles. Yeah.
And the trinity on the left is what I was talking about: entropy, Heisenberg, and Gödel. That's the trinity that had Boyd learned out of EM theory. Now, here's when we talk about the diversity of thought between Mark and I think Mark has better strength in theory and history of conflict. the war, and then, or the war side of things, warfare side of things. Where I ended up coming into the OODA Loop was more on the science and math side, the psychology, anthropology, complexity, and things like that. And it wasn't, and I know we can dive a little deeper into this, but that's where I really started making the connections to Boyd's work, was that science and math pathway.
And
then
it's interesting that you say that, Ponch, because I've been very focused on the Eastern philosophy now side of this, which is what is drawing me into what Boyd is talking about here, that's cool. I think we kind of come together at it from all different perspectives. So Mark, you were about to say something about Chet, who is the author of this graphic. What were you going to say?
Chet was one of John Boyd's collaborators, was on a recent episode of our show. Mm-hmm. And Chet has done an amazing amount of work in not only preserving and maintain the integrity of what Boyd produced, but also encouraging guys like Ponch and I to encourage others to develop and understand these ideas better. But he put this together a few years ago. It was 2013, so about 10 years ago now. And the point of it is to show that the epistemology of the OODA Loop, in other words, the inputs that went into the OODA Loop sketch as we understand it before John Boyd died, drew from so many disciplines. And it starts in 1976. It also forgets the previous sort of say 25, maybe even 30 years prior to that, where he's developing the aerial attack study. He's developing energy maneuverability theory. He's, as Ponch mentioned, he's going back to get an undergrad from Georgia Tech in industrial engineering so that he can get better versed in these topics that would serve him well when it came to fighter design, when it came to connecting the theoretical to application, where scientists could actually understand him. He could communicate with them better and drive home his points, because there is a lot of it, I'm sure, where it's kind of, he sensed and felt things, but did an unbelievable amount of work to, so I guess maybe say academically justify his ability to talk about these things intelligently and have them broadly accepted.
So I want to pull that string a little bit further, but for those in our audience that aren't familiar with OODA, can you just give us a very quick, what does OODA stand for, first of all? What is that final version in that graphic you just showed us with the loop? And what problem was it designed to solve?
OODA itself stands for observe, orient, decide, act. The loop is the learning, the feedback loops that come where I would observe again, I would reorient, I would update and revise my model of understanding to come up with a decision which he defines as a hypothesis, to an action which he defines as a test. My methodology of going about teaching it to others is really to focus on orientation, which Boyd did and others, where we understand that orientation is something like our internal operating system. That's the example I use with most, is hold up your iPhone, hold up your iPad. It has an internal operating system. If you don't update it or revise it, what happens? Mm-hmm. The human computer is the same way. The human mind, the human body, it's the same way. If we don't continuously update our models of understanding as circumstances unfold, well, we're going to be obsolete. We're not going to be able to adapt. So orientation is important, because actually the most important part of OODA, and this is where Ponch and I think probably was one of our first really big agreements in surveying the landscape of how people teach OODA. People forget that the orientation implicitly guides and controls how you observe. Mm-hmm. It also implicitly guides and controls how you act, therefore how you decide and learn. That's what most people misunderstand. So the things that we put into our orientation, so who we are, where we're from, our cognitive abilities, our emotional states, our psychological states, those all make up who we are and shape in turn how we see and observe things. So you and I could look at the same set of facts and come up with completely different conclusions. Absolutely. Because our orientations are different, and every orientation is like a fingerprint. Mm-hmm. It's apt that your title of your podcast is called Intersections, because where they intersect, we can form alignment to form a team, to form a tribe, to form a Marine Corps, to form a fighter squadron, et cetera. We have intersectionality inside of those orientations, and we agree that we can focus and direct and coordinate action together. But at the same time, we retain that uniqueness of each orientation being completely different. So OODA is nothing more than how it functions an OODA loop in quotes, and if you use John Boyd's work directly that we've pulled out of the archives and we've held in our hands, he uses loop and quotes, and he just calls it a sketch. And it's an imperfect, in his assessment, it's an imperfect illustrative understanding of how our orientation functions as circumstances unfold. It's not set in stone. It's not a iterative process I follow along like a map in that respect. It's just merely to teach and reinforce the concept of how orientation implicitly guides and controls. That's really the big thing. And I've even taken it out of papers I've written because sometimes the graphics distract and get people off of the main point, I think, which is orientation.
People gravitate towards the graphic, they gravitate towards the process, and they want it to be a fixed thing, right? They want it to be a set of instructions that are telling them this is what's going to happen and here's the outcome. And what I've noticed is, because I teach Agile, I teach DevSecOps, and in the university, I also teach evidence-based research, which is very OODA, like at the heart. It's all the same thing, right? It's about observing, and it's about being willing to take in new inputs, right? And learn from that continuously and adjust the way you're thinking about it. But you are building that bridge as you are walking on it, right? I can't promise you a specific outcome in that process. But what I can promise you is that by doing it that way, we are collaborating. We are going to come up with the best possible outcome at the end of this. And
one brief revision, I would say that he's not quoted as ever saying imperfect. What I meant by that is that as Ponch and I have dug through his work, I would say maybe imprecise or something that needs to maintain its status of impermanent, needs to continue to be evolved and developed as we continue to reorient. And by the way, you backed yourself right into that one. That's how we named the podcast No Way Out, because in his brief conceptual spiral, he says, given all of the things like entropy, quantum imprecision, mathematical imprecision, ambiguity, et cetera, there's no way out unless we can make all those things go away, which we can't. Therefore, we have to continuously reorient because our orientation shapes how we see, how we decide, how we act, how we learn.
I love that so much. I mean, I almost, I wish I was alive when Boyd was around, because that would have been a fascinating conversation. But back to, I loved your connecting with the term intersections. So that's exactly why Prachi and I named our podcast Intersections. The vision that we had with our podcast was you're at a cafe and we meet, and we're talking, and the sparks fly, right? Because we're tying together all these disparate thoughts that seem on the surface to not be related, and yet they are so interconnected. And that's, a challenge to communicate sometimes to folks, right? About where those things intersect, because they do seem completely disparate. So Ponch, did you have anything to add to, I guess, the discussion on what OODA is and the problem that it's solving?
No, I think Mark summed it up pretty well. The latest research is coming out on how humans perceive the world reflects what we see in what John Boyd created with the OODA Loop, which is pretty fascinating. So you get into active inference, you get into perception as a controlled hallucination, you get into Bayesian inference, you get into minimizing surprise and entropy and things like that. These things are pretty far advanced, and these are things that are being built into today's AI machine learning capabilities. And that's absolutely fascinating. It's something that Boyd was able to look at with the Trinity and what he did with math and science and complexity theory, early complexity theory, and how that is standing true today as many of these scientists and researchers from neuroscience, cognitive science, physics, biology are coming to the same conclusion. The challenge with that is they are so deeply involved with their own fields that they don't look across those intersections, right? And that's what we're talking about on No Way Out is, hey, let's take a guy who has a background in physics and let's take a PhD with her background in neuroscience and have a conversation and see the intersections again of how Boyd came to this conclusion. So there's a lot of richness inside of Boyd's OODA Loop that many people overlook. And even today's advanced, what would I call them, military themed organizations that run around and dance on stage and talk about the OODA Loop, they get it wrong. All right. They absolutely get it wrong. It's almost embarrassing to wear the same uniform as them or have worn the same uniform with them. And I know they're probably going to listen to this. There's a reason I don't work with many of them right now. So absolutely fascinating stuff. And the Agile connection is insane too,
Yeah,
You may be aware that the Toyota production system was influenced the OODA Loop. You
absolutely.
may be aware Scrum is built off of OODA Loop and Toyota
Yep.
production system. You may be aware that the Lean Startup was influenced by the OODA Loop and Stephen
Well, when I
Blank's work.
first started my career back in, where was it, like 97. So I did a lot of government training, right, for program management and all the things, and Lean and Tachi Ono and all the things that he was doing, and wrote about. I became fascinated with that, and that's how I got introduced to OODA. And as I kept learning, just that, I just gravitated always to that philosophy. And I didn't understand either, right? I was struggling for a long time with understanding, why is this not more of a focus? Why is this not more emphasized in the way that we're just learning it on the periphery again, right? It's one of many things, but to me it seemed so fundamental. Anytime, to your point, like military leaders would talk about acceleration and going faster and making better decisions, I'm like, well, we have everything we need with all of this work that has been done already. Anyways, I like, back to the intersections and what you guys are doing with connecting Boyd's work and OODA and the philosophies behind OODA to other things. And Ponch, you just talked about AI, and this is so fundamental to understanding AI, right? Because it is not a program, it is a model, and it needs inputs, just like what Mark even went through, right? Like our brains, and it is inherently dumb, right? AI is not smart, doesn't come out being smart. It's just an algorithm, and you have to train it, and you have to constantly train it. Like even with this Chat GPT now, I am so frustrated because everybody keeps thinking that, it's a search capability. It is not a search capability. It has been trained on very limited things in its model, and it will not get smarter unless you change that model and train the model. And there's danger with that because it gets things wrong, and it gets things wrong with a lot of things, but we actually have no way of tracing back to where the source of that error is, because it doesn't tell us where it got that information from. So I this understanding of OODA and how we need to think about that is so fundamental to understanding how we use AI, and how, especially in the context of military decision making, so that we know what the confidence level is, how this AI came up, right? How we can explain what the AI did, and then add to it with our own human in the loop discussion. So
Can I add? Can I ask?
absolutely,
I mean,
yes.
what Ponch was saying about how other groups would talk about the OODA Loop, and other, maybe even veterans like us that are teaching and training. It's almost like if AI was saying, you said, tell me about the OODA Loop or whatever, it might revert back to something like that, where it might only be focused on the physical aspects of OODA and maybe the mental, whereas our approach and in our business and in our teaching is more on the moral side of things, in the mental side, so that it's understood at the highest possible level, or we're aspiring to understand at the highest possible level. Because as you say, AI is dumb, and it just becomes a regurgitative thing of faulty inputs that people had put. What Ponch and I think this is one of the reasons why, in a lot of respects, we're brothers from another mother on this, is that John Boyd left all of this open intentionally to continually be developed, but also you have to go out and learn it. So when you go out and quote unquote teach OODA Loop, and you teach it in the context of military or software development or anything else, if you haven't done the additional work on understanding what is behind Boyd's work, you've absolutely missed it. So there's a lot of things we can just turn off right away. We're like, well, I know that this is going to just degrade because it doesn't get to the core point. It's not about learning. It's not about adapting. It's about helping people in physical environments on a quarterly basis, on a monthly basis, on what's right in front of me, rather than, and then they miss the complete big picture.
Yeah. On the Eastern philosophy side too, what I'm learning is, if you start looking at the OODA Loop and Boyd's work as a way of being, it's just the way things are. If you understand that from a self-awareness perspective, then you can start coming up with better processes, approaches, methods to find your way through this VUCA world. And that way you can do something in your environment. And Boyd talks about that too. So by being the OODA Loop, by understanding it, by understanding these things, you create better ways to navigate the external environment. right? And that's coming from Eastern philosophy. We're going to learn more about that here in the next few months as we start bringing on some folks that have deep knowledge in that space. So very exciting times for
it's so exciting. And like I said, that's where I've gravitated towards this kind of thinking, is through from the Eastern philosophy side of things. So my dissertation topic was on collaboration and intra-organizational collaboration, and what leads to a better process, a better product, a better service, because I was so frustrated with what I was seeing in my own organization about how it was so challenging for us to share information and make decisions together. And it was actually easier for me to collaborate with people like you than it was within my own organization. And it was bizarre to me, because, and it wasn't because people were bad or that they weren't smart enough or anything, but it was a mindset, right? It was a mindset, and it was a way of, and it was the, your inability to sort of do more than just system one thinking, which is reactive, right? We are so anchored in, this is how we do it. This is how we've always done it. And we're not going to deviate from the ways that we've always done it. And that was making me insane. And so my dissertation topic was all about uncovering this challenge, this problem. And I didn't even know where it was going to go, because I think, I even went into my dissertation thinking I knew the answer, right? Here's the reasons why. But I quickly, like you guys were saying, the more you learn, the more you dig deeper into all the different philosophies. And, I saw in your chart there, Mark, Kuan and Popper. I read all of those also. And oh my God, I'm like, I don't even know the answer to this question that I'm asking. And, of course, my dissertation chair was very quick to say, nothing until I tell you here, things. And, but this took me down the path of, mindfulness and what's behind this mindfulness, and neuroscience, and what's going on with our brains. And I would love to introduce you guys to a scholar. His name is Richard Boyatzis. So he's out at Case Western, and he actually has written prolifically on this idea of resonance. And he's working with a neuroscientist. I forget her name right now, but I'll send you guys the connections. But they did brain scans of members of across the board, musicians, scientists, Marines, all the spec ops. And they worked a lot with the special operations forces because they were consultants to them. And what they observed was, so you would think that someone that was in the SEALs or Marines are under so much stress that their brains are completely system one all the time. And that could not have been further from the truth. They were the most mindful people on the planet because of two things in his research, was that instrumental intimacy, what they call trust, right? So they operationalized the trust that you have because of the extensive training that they all go through, right? And that knowledge that I've trained with you, Ponch, and I know exactly what you know. And when we're in a firefight together, you have my back, I have your back, and that's it, right? I don't even have to worry about it. So whatever comes, whatever I have to observe and now make a decision, we know that no matter what's coming at us, we're going to respond in a certain way, and we're going to take care of each other. And in no other organization do we have that kind of depth of relationship, right? So that's number one. And then two is that training, is the deep domain understanding of the thing that you are doing and the thing that you know how to do, to the point that it's muscle memory, right? So you're in flow. I think we talked about this flow idea, Mark, at your podcast, that so everything that's new, I can integrate and I can riff off of that. I don't need to worry about the thing that I know already, because we've trained so much on it. I know how to do that. And also in most organizations, we don't have that depth of workforce skill, right? That we know exactly how to do the work that we are doing, to the point where anything new that comes at us, we're just continuous learners, right? And that's all we're going to do is take new inputs and integrate it into what we know, because that's how we've been trained.
That's all the time we've got for part one. If you want to see part two, keep your eyes and ears peeled, because it's coming very soon. And I want to wish you all a very great day and give you a quick reminder that this has been Intersections Podcast. The Samaya Studios are wonderful. Check them out on LinkedIn. Also, check out Spark Studios and UAHI2C anywhere on the internet. That's right, UAHI2C. I will see you in the next episode. onward and upward.